Picture this. You are standing inside a flickering torchlit canvas tent on the muddy edge of the Germanic frontier. The air is thick with the coppery stench of blood, the sickly sweetness of wild honey, and the sharp bite of sour wine. You watch as a young Greek physician kneels over a dying Roman centurion, his bronze instruments laid out on a folded square of clean linen beside him. In his right hand, he grips a small, terrifying device called a trepan, a hand-cranked drill designed to bore a perfect hole through a human skull. The centurion's head is swollen, purple, leaking. A javelin had struck him sideways 3 hours ago, fracturing the bone and trapping blood beneath it. By every rule of Roman military medicine, this man is already dead. The young physician is named Marcus Tullius Severus, and he is about to break sacred Roman law to save him. You watch as he places the bronze tip against the skull, whispers a single prayer in Greek, and begins to turn the crank. Blood pulses out. The centurion gasps and twitches, and behind Severus, just visible at the edge of the torchlight, his own commanding legate steps silently into the tent with a gladius drawn from its sheath. The legate is not here to defend him. The legate is here to execute him. The fall of Marcus Tullius Severus marks one of the darkest, most deliberately erased chapters in the long, brutal history of Rome's legions. A brilliant healer, condemned by the very army he was trying to save. Ancient suppressed medical texts and fragments preserved by later Greek writers hint at the sheer horror of this moment. A physician weeping over a man he had just saved, knowing his own death was minutes away. If a man who heals can be slaughtered by the men he heals for, who exactly is the Roman army protecting? How did the most disciplined fighting force on earth end up murdering its own greatest healer in a single torchlit night? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths buried beneath the marble and the glory of Rome, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different corners of the world, connected across centuries by our shared curiosity about the past. What you are about to hear is not the polished version of Roman military medicine that fills the pages of school textbooks. This is the version Rome's own historians worked very hard to erase. The version where healing was often a slower, more dignified form of execution. The version where the men with the bronze instruments were sometimes more dangerous than the men with the swords. To understand how a gifted young physician ended up dying on the edge of a forest in Germania, we have to rewind the clock to a quieter, sunnier corner of the empire, where a brilliant young mind first dared to believe he could change everything. To comprehend this unprecedented act of medical murder, we must rewind the clock just 4 years. The year is 5 AD. Marcus Tullius Severus was only 22 years old when he received his bronze diploma and his official commission into the legions. But he was not a fragile, bookish scholar waiting for older doctors to guide him through the realities of military service. He was a ferocious intellectual, a fiery reformer who had spent his entire adolescence inside the greatest medical library the ancient world had ever produced. He had studied at Alexandria. He had walked the same marble corridors where Herophilus had once dissected the human body in pursuit of truth. He had apprenticed under physicians who spoke Greek, Aramaic, Persian, and Egyptian. He could recite Hippocrates from memory in 2 languages. He understood the use of opium, the management of compound fractures, the careful art of suturing intestinal wounds. He had seen things in the wards of Alexandria that the average Roman medicus could not even imagine. And he was entirely convinced of his own unparalleled brilliance. Perhaps that was his very first fatal mistake. You see, knowledge without humility is a profoundly dangerous weapon, especially when you are dropped into an institution that has built itself on centuries of rigid tradition. Young Severus looked around the Roman military medical system and saw nothing but frustrating, bloodthirsty stagnation. He obsessively studied the writings of the great Greek physicians, men who had catalogued hundreds of treatments and surgical procedures with cold scientific precision. But when he looked into the field hospitals of his own legion, the reality was a bitter disappointment. The Valetudinarium, the Roman military hospital, was originally designed to be the most advanced medical facility in the known world. By the time Severus arrived on the Germanic frontier, it had transformed into something far darker. The senior physicians were political appointees. The orderlies were often retired soldiers with no real training. Critical supplies were rationed not by need but by rank. Wounded legionaries were triaged not by the severity of their injuries, but by their proximity to powerful officers. For a fiery, deeply idealistic young Greek like Severus, this institutional rot was a profound personal insult. He simply did not possess the quiet, calculating patience of older doctors who had learned how to bend the system slowly from within. He was a young man who demanded immediate, absolute perfection. Instead of playing the political game, he openly displayed his contempt for his senior colleagues. He began performing forbidden Greek procedures behind canvas walls. He aggressively challenged the official treatment protocols during morning briefings. He operated under the dangerous delusion that his superior knowledge alone, his clear medical brilliance, made him completely untouchable. We often forget how deeply intoxicating sheer intelligence can be to a young, developing mind. Severus genuinely believed, right down to his bones, that he was uniquely destined to be the savior of Roman military medicine. He envisioned a sweeping reform, a total ruthless reset of how Rome cared for its wounded. But in his desperate rush to become a historical legend, he completely misread the room. He ignored a fundamental unwritten rule of survival in the legions. You never declare war on the supply chain unless you already have a much bigger, much deadlier army standing behind you. He was rapidly isolating himself, alienating the very men who controlled every bandage, every drop of opium, and every measure of clean wine in the entire camp. To truly understand what Severus was up against, you have to understand the brutal, deeply hierarchical reality of medical care inside a Roman legion in 5 AD. On paper, the system was magnificent. Every legion of roughly 5,000 men was assigned a permanent field hospital, staffed with physicians, orderlies, and surgical assistants. Bronze instruments were standardized across the empire. Wounded soldiers had a higher survival rate than civilians in many parts of the Roman world. But beneath this gleaming polished surface, the institution was rotting from within. The chain of command in a valetudinarium was a tangled, vicious web. At the top sat the medicus castrensis, the senior camp physician, usually a Roman citizen with strong political connections but often only modest medical skill. Beneath him served the medici ordinarii, the working physicians like Severus, the men who actually performed the surgeries and managed the wards. Below them stood the capsarii, the bandage carriers, ordinary soldiers given basic field training. And lurking around the entire structure, controlling the lifeblood of the hospital, were the quaestors and the options valetudinarii, the supply officers and quartermasters. These supply officers held a terrifying invisible power. They controlled the inventory. They controlled the imports from the eastern provinces. They controlled which physician received which materials and when. A medicus who displeased them might suddenly find that his shipment of opium had been delayed by months. His sutures might mysteriously disappear. His clean linen might be redirected to the personal tent of a tribune with a sore back. For Severus, the corruption was not hypothetical. He saw it every single day. Crates of imported silphium, a plant so valuable it was worth more than its weight in silver, would arrive from Cyrenaica and quietly vanish before reaching the surgical tents. Amphorae of honey, the single most reliable wound-cleaning agent in the ancient pharmacopoeia, would appear in the markets of nearby trading posts at suspiciously low prices. The same was true of vinegar, the harsh sour wine used to clean infected wounds, a substance so essential that Greek physicians considered it sacred. Honey and vinegar, the two miracle substances that the entire Roman military medical system depended on, the sweet and the sour, the gentle and the harsh. Severus had been taught at Alexandria that honey drew out infection while vinegar killed it, and that a physician without both was simply a butcher with a bronze knife. And in his own valetudinarium, both were systematically being stolen from his patients. His first defiant act was small. He began purchasing his own honey from a Germanic trader who came through the camp every few weeks. He paid for it with his personal salary, carrying the heavy clay jars to his tent under his cloak. When wounded men arrived with infected lacerations, he would treat them with his own private supply and quietly omit the entry from the official medical ledgers. It was a tiny act of rebellion. But in the rigid bookkeeping of a Roman military camp, every untracked jar of honey was a small, loud declaration of war against the men who profited from controlling them. The supply officers noticed. They said nothing at first, but they began to watch him. The year was 7 AD, and the eastern frontier of Germania was beginning to simmer. The Cherusci tribes, long thought to be quietly Romanized, were growing restless. Border patrols were ambushed more frequently. Small skirmishes erupted in the deep forests where Roman cavalry struggled to maneuver. The wounded began trickling back to the valetudinarium in larger numbers than the senior physicians had anticipated. On one particular evening in late summer, a full century of legionaries was ambushed at a river crossing. 43 men were brought back to the hospital tents in carts, their wounds packed with whatever filthy rags the orderlies in the field had been able to find. Severus rushed into the triage area expecting the worst. What he found was far darker than the worst. The opium reserves were empty. The silphium had not arrived from Cyrenaica in 3 months. The clean linen had been reallocated to support a senior tribune's recovery from gout. There was barely enough vinegar to clean a dozen wounds, let alone 43. Severus stood in the center of his hospital, surrounded by groaning, bleeding men, and felt a cold, black rage rising in his chest. He knew exactly where the missing supplies had gone. He had watched the quartermaster's wagons rolling out of the supply depot for months. He knew the names of the merchants in the nearby trading post who were buying the stolen medicines for a fraction of their value. He knew which centurions were taking bribes to look the other way. And on that brutal, sleepless night, with the screams of dying legionaries echoing through the canvas walls, Severus made his second fatal mistake. He let his rage show. When the senior camp physician finally arrived to inspect the chaos, Severus did not bow. He did not hold his tongue. He openly accused the supply officers by name of murdering Roman soldiers through theft. He demanded an immediate investigation. He declared in front of 3 centurions and a passing tribune that the valetudinarium had become a slaughterhouse, and that the men responsible should be flogged in the parade ground. There is an old Greek proverb that Severus must have forgotten in that moment. A physician who accuses the powerful in public has already prescribed his own death. The senior physician went pale, then quietly red. The tribune said nothing but turned and walked out of the tent. The centurions exchanged glances and shuffled their feet. By morning, 14 of the 43 wounded men had died from infections that any well-stocked Roman hospital should have been able to prevent. By the following week, every supply officer on the camp knew Severus's name, and every one of them now had a personal reason to want him dead. He had not just embarrassed them, he had marked them, and in the cold, patient world of Roman military bureaucracy, marked men do not forgive. They wait. Part 6. Over the next 2 years, Severus did something that no Roman physician of his rank had ever dared to do. He began building a hidden network inside the legion. He started small. He cultivated friendships with the capsarii, the lowly bandage carriers, the men whose hands were on every wounded soldier before the senior physicians ever arrived. He taught them quietly, in stolen evening hours, how to clean wounds properly with vinegar. He showed them how to recognize the early signs of infection. He demonstrated how to set a broken bone without crushing the surrounding tissue. He turned ordinary orderlies into competent medical practitioners, men who could save lives without waiting for the official supplies that would never come. He also began smuggling. He used his personal salary to bring in shipments of Greek medical supplies through a quiet merchant from Corinth named Thuron, a man who had once been a battlefield surgeon himself before retiring into trade. The shipments arrived hidden inside crates of olive oil and dried figs. Severus stored them in a locked chest beneath his cot and distributed them only to patients who would otherwise have died. And most dangerously, he began to write. In the long, cold nights of the Germanic winter, Severus produced a private scroll. He documented every theft he had witnessed. He named every officer involved. He recorded the dates of missing shipments, the names of the merchants buying stolen Roman medicines, and the rough estimated value of the corruption. He hid the scroll inside the false bottom of his medical chest, and he told no one of its existence. What Severus did not know was that he had already been seen. He had been seen for a long time. The man watching him was named Quintus Varius Falco. Falco was the chief quartermaster of Legio XIX, a tall, lean, soft-voiced Italian from a wealthy equestrian family. He had served in the supply corps for nearly 20 years and had built a personal fortune that rivaled some senators. Falco was not a violent man. He was something far more dangerous. He was a patient one. For 2 years, Falco had quietly observed the young Greek physician. He had noted the unauthorized honey shipments. He had bribed an orderly to count the contents of Severus's locked chest. He had even arranged, through a third party, for one of his agents to befriend Thuron the Corinthian merchant and learn exactly what was being smuggled into the camp. By the late summer of 9 AD, Falco had assembled a complete picture of Severus's operation. And then, through a junior assistant whom he had quietly bribed with a small gold coin, Falco learned of the scroll. The scroll changed everything. Falco could tolerate a young idealist treating soldiers with smuggled honey. He could not tolerate a written record of his entire criminal enterprise sitting inside a physician's tent. He understood immediately that if that scroll ever reached the legate, or worse, reached the provincial governor in Mogontiacum, his life of comfortable wealth would end with a rope around his neck. Falco began to plan. He did not need to act quickly. He simply needed to wait for the right moment, a moment when Severus would be vulnerable, distracted, exhausted, and surrounded by chaos. A moment when one more dead body in a field hospital would attract no questions at all. And in the cold, dripping forests of northern Germania, that moment was already galloping toward them at the head of 3 Roman legions. Part 7. It is September of 9 AD, and the air over the Germanic frontier has grown thick with a strange electric tension. Publius Quinctilius Varus, the Roman governor of Germania, is marching 3 full legions, Legio XVI, Legio XVII, and Legio XIX, deep into the dark trackless forests northeast of the Rhine. He has been told by a trusted Germanic ally named Arminius that a small rebellion needs to be quietly suppressed. He does not yet know that Arminius has been preparing this trap for years. Marcus Tullius Severus is attached to Legio XIX, stationed at a rear field hospital camp just behind the main marching column. He spends his days treating the usual collection of march injuries, blistered feet, twisted ankles, the occasional fever. He does not yet know that within 48 hours, his hospital is going to become the doorway to the most catastrophic Roman military disaster in nearly a century. The ambush erupts on a rainy afternoon in the Teutoburg forest. Germanic warriors pour out of the trees in numbers that no Roman scout had reported. The legions, strung out for miles along a narrow forest track, cannot form their disciplined battle lines. The rain soaks their leather and rusts their iron. The forest swallows their formations whole. Within hours, What was supposed to be a routine punitive expedition has transformed into a slaughter. The wounded begin arriving at Severus's hospital by the dozens, then by the hundreds, men with arrows lodged in their lungs, men with crushed limbs from German clubs, men with their bellies opened and their intestines packed back inside with handfuls of moss, men who should already be dead but who are still somehow breathing, still somehow begging for help. Severus stands in the center of the largest hospital tent and feels the entire weight of his Greek education pressing down on him. He knows, with absolute cold clarity, what is about to happen. If he follows official Roman medical protocol, if he triages by rank and waits for proper authorization to perform surgeries, 90% of these men will die before sunrise. The system was never designed for a catastrophe of this scale. The supplies are not there. The senior physicians are panicking. The orderlies are running in circles. So Severus makes a decision. He decides to break every rule. He summons his trained capsarii, the bandage carriers he has been quietly educating for 2 years, and he gives them their orders. They will work as full surgeons tonight. He distributes his entire smuggled supply chest. He breaks open the locked cabinet of opium that had been reserved for officers and pours its contents into a common bowl. He performs trepanations on men with head wounds without waiting for the senior physician's approval. He amputates shattered limbs at the joint, a Greek technique forbidden by Roman tradition. He opens abdominal cavities to retrieve broken arrowheads, a procedure that any senior Roman medicus would have considered insane. For one long, blood-soaked, torchlit night, Severus and his small band of trained orderlies operate at the absolute outer edge of what was medically possible in the ancient world. By dawn, more than 60 men are alive who, by every Roman regulation, should be dead. The tent floor is ankle-deep in blood and mud. Severus has not eaten or slept in over 30 hours. His hands are shaking so violently he can barely hold his bronze instruments. And in the calm gray morning light, Quintus Varius Falco walks calmly into the hospital tent with a small escort of guards and a satisfied, almost gentle smile on his face. He has found his moment. Part 8. In the cold, pale hours after the chaos, Severus realized he had one last desperate card to play. He had broken every Roman military medical regulation in a single night. He had performed dozens of unauthorized surgeries. He had distributed officer-only supplies to common legionaries. He had given direct surgical orders to men who were technically only bandage carriers. By the rigid letter of Roman military law, he could be executed several times over. But he also believed, deep in his Greek-educated heart, that he had one ally left in the entire camp who would understand what he had done. The senior tribune of Legio XIX, a man named Gaius Numerius Plancus. 3 years earlier, Plancus had fallen gravely ill with a marsh fever that no senior physician had been able to treat. Severus had personally nursed him through 6 brutal nights, sitting beside his cot, administering willow bark infusions and cold cloths, refusing to leave until the fever broke. Plancus had publicly thanked him afterward, calling him a brother in all but blood. If any man in the entire legion still owed Severus a debt of life, it was Gaius Numerius Plancus. Severus walked across the muddy camp at sunrise, his physician's tunic still soaked with the blood of the men he had saved, and he requested a private audience with the tribune. He brought his scroll with him, the hidden documentation of every theft Falco had ever committed. He intended to use it as both a defense and a weapon. Plancus received him in his command tent. The tribune looked older than Severus remembered, his face thinner, his eyes more guarded. Severus made his case carefully. He explained the corruption. He explained the night of impossible surgeries. He explained that without immediate authorization to continue treating the wounded with forbidden techniques, dozens more men would die in the coming days. He laid the scroll on the table between them and waited. There is a particular silence that fills a tent when a man realizes he has badly miscalculated. Severus heard that silence before Plancus ever spoke. Plancus looked at the scroll. He looked at Severus, and then he very slowly pushed the scroll back across the table. "You should not have written this down," the tribune said quietly. "You have made it impossible for me to protect you." Severus did not understand at first. He began to speak again, to argue, to explain. But Plancus raised a single hand and silenced him. The tribune then told him, in a flat, tired voice, that Falco had visited him 3 nights ago. That Falco had offered him a gift of 200 aurei, an absolutely staggering sum, more than a tribune's annual salary. That Falco had explained, very persuasively, that the young Greek physician was a threat to Roman military discipline itself. That his foreign techniques were undermining the authority of senior officers. That his constant accusations were destabilizing the supply chain at a critical moment of war. And Plancus, the man whose life Severus had saved, had taken the gold. The tribune did not apologize. He did not even look ashamed. He simply explained that Severus would be arrested at dawn the following morning and brought before the legate for a military trial. The charges would include unauthorized surgery, theft of military supplies, distribution of restricted medicines, insubordination, and conduct unbecoming a Roman officer. The outcome was already decided. Severus stood in the silence of the tent for a long moment. He understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just watched his entire world collapse, that he was already dead. He had been dead the moment Falco learned of the scroll. He had just been too arrogant to see it. He picked up his scroll from the table. He turned and walked out of the tribune's tent without saying another word. Outside, the morning sun was beginning to break through the clouds over the Germanic forest, and the screams of wounded men were still drifting from the hospital tents he would never see again. Part 9. The dawn arrived gray and cold. 2 legionaries entered Severus's small physician's tent without knocking. He recognized both of them immediately. One was a man named Felix, whose shattered forearm he had set 6 months earlier. The other was a young recruit named Tertius, whose feverish lung infection he had treated through 3 sleepless nights the previous winter. Neither of them met his eyes. They had been ordered to arrest him, and they obeyed. They stripped him of his physician's bronze diploma, the small engraved plate that marked his official commission. They took his medical kit, the carefully maintained set of instruments he had carried with him since Alexandria. They removed his cloak. They left him in his blood-stained physician's tunic, the same one he had worn through the long night of impossible surgeries, and they bound his hands behind his back with a length of leather cord. Then they marched him through the camp. In the rigid theatrical world of Roman military discipline, public humiliation was a critical part of any officer's downfall. The army needed every soldier to see the fall. The army needed every soldier to understand that no rank, no skill, no past service could protect a man from the consequences of breaking the chain of command. So they did not take Severus directly to the legate's tent. They walked him in a slow, deliberate procession through the entire length of the camp. They walked him past the parade ground, where sentries were already drilling in the morning light. They walked him past the supply depot, where Quintus Varius Falco stood in the doorway watching with that same gentle, satisfied smile. They walked him past the cavalry stables, the bakery wagons, the Praetorian tents. And then, with deliberate cruelty, they walked him past the rows of hospital tents, where the men he had saved during the night were still recovering. The wounded saw him. Some of them tried to sit up. Some of them called his name. A centurion named Octavius, whose leg Severus had amputated below the knee in a desperate 20-minute surgery, dragged himself to the entrance of his tent and watched in silent horror as the young physician who had saved his life was paraded past in chains. Another legionary, a young man whose abdominal wound Severus had cleaned and stitched closed at 3 in the morning, reached out from his cot and pressed a small bronze coin into Severus's bound palm in a desperate gesture of gratitude. A passing centurion saw the coin. He struck it from Severus's hand with the back of his fist. The coin spun across the muddy ground and disappeared under the wheel of a supply cart. Severus did not cry out. He did not speak. He walked with his head held as steady as he could manage, his eyes fixed on the gray sky over the forest. While the men he had healed wept silently from the doorways of their hospital tents. A historical fragment preserved much later by a Greek writer named Diodorus of Sicyon describes this moment in chilling detail. The fragment claims that as Severus passed the final hospital tent, a young Capsarius, one of the bandage carriers he had personally trained, stepped out into the path of the guards with a small ceramic jar in his hands. The jar contained honey. The young man tried to press it into Severus's bound hands as a final tribute, a final acknowledgement of everything the physician had taught him. The guards knocked the jar from the boy's hands. It shattered on the muddy ground. The honey spread slowly across the dirt, golden and sweet and utterly wasted, mixing with the rainwater and the blood of the previous night's battle. The boy was flogged that same afternoon. Part 10. They brought Severus into the legate's command tent at the 8th hour of the morning. The trial, if it could even be called a trial, lasted less than 30 minutes. The charges were read aloud by a junior tribune. Falco stood in the corner of the tent, his hands folded behind his back, watching with the calm patience of a man who has finally completed a long, delicate task. Severus was permitted to speak in his own defense. He used his time well. He did not beg. He did not apologize. He stood in the center of the tent in his blood-soaked tunic, and he laid out every detail of Falco's corruption in clear, precise Greek-trained Latin. He named the missing shipments. He named the merchants in the nearby trading posts who had purchased stolen Roman medicines. He named the centurions who had taken bribes. He produced his scroll and read aloud from it for nearly 15 minutes, while the legate sat in stony silence behind his folding camp table. It changed nothing. The legate had already been spoken to. The legate had already accepted his own quiet gift from Falco's network. The legate listened to Severus's accusations with the same blank expression a man wears while waiting for a long, boring speech to end. When Severus finally fell silent, the legate simply nodded to the guards and pronounced the sentence. Severus was taken outside the command tent at the 9th hour of the morning. They did not bother with the elaborate ceremonies reserved for higher-ranking officers. 2 legionaries forced him to his knees in the mud. A 3rd legionary, a heavily muscled veteran named Sextus, drew his gladius and struck once with the cold mechanical efficiency that the Roman army had perfected over centuries. The brilliant young Greek physician who had tried to reform the most powerful military medical system in the ancient world was dead before his body finished falling. His scroll was burned. His medical instruments were distributed among the senior physicians of Legio XIX, men who had no idea how to properly use them. His private supply chest was confiscated by Falco himself and quietly sold off through the same merchants who had been buying stolen Roman medicines for years. Within 3 weeks, the catastrophe in the Teutoburg forest had grown so vast that Severus's execution was completely forgotten. Varus and his 3 legions were annihilated. Legio XVI, Legio XVII, and Legio XIX were wiped from the rolls of the Roman army. Their numbers were never used again, considered cursed for centuries. The death of one Greek physician became an irrelevant footnote inside a far larger imperial disaster. But history, as we have already seen, possesses a remarkably dark and unforgiving sense of humor. Quintus Varius Falco survived the Teutoburg disaster. He retired from the legions a few years later, returned to his estate outside Rome, and settled into a comfortable life of inherited wealth and quiet investment. He lived for another 14 years. And then, in the autumn of 23 AD, Falco developed a small abscess on the inside of his right thigh, the kind of minor infection that any reasonably trained Capsarius could have drained and cleaned in under an hour. His personal Roman physician, an aristocratic appointment with no real surgical training, refused to perform such a vulgar procedure. The abscess grew. The infection spread into his blood. Falco died screaming in a marble villa, surrounded by the very wealth he had built from stolen medicines, killed by the exact kind of treatable infection that Severus and his trained orderlies had been curing in muddy tents on the Germanic frontier for years. The dark side of Rome eventually consumes everyone who attempts to master it. And the techniques that Severus pioneered did not die with him. The Capsara he had trained survived the disaster. They scattered across the empire after Legio XIX was disbanded. They carried his methods with them into other legions, into civilian practices, into the apprenticeships of younger physicians. The Greek surgical techniques he had brought to the muddy hospital tents of Germania quietly spread through the Roman medical world over the following decades, taught in whispered apprenticeships, never formally credited, never officially acknowledged. So how should we ultimately remember Marcus Tullius Severus? Was he a brilliant, ahead-of-his-time healer who accurately diagnosed the fatal corruption killing the Roman military medical system, only to be murdered by the very institution he was trying to save? Or was he a deeply arrogant, recklessly idealistic young Greek who tragically miscalculated the vicious, unforgiving reality of Roman military hierarchy? Perhaps he was simply a tragic combination of both. A true visionary who tried to move much too fast through a violent world that absolutely refused to change. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of the darkest, most deliberately erased moments in Roman military history. If you found this story of corruption, healing, and tragedy as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more immersive historical documentaries. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Was Severus a visionary healer ahead of his time, or just a reckless idealist who couldn't accept that Rome was never built to save its sons? I read every single comment, and I cannot wait to see your thoughts. Until next time, keep questioning the past.